7 generations. That's how long Mewtwo sat in Ubers without a single drop. Not one generation where it slipped down, got reevaluated, and came back. Just 7 straight eras of competitive Pokemon where the answer was always the same. Mewtwo is too strong for standard play. Think about what that means. The game changed completely between 1996 and 2017. New types, new mechanics, new legendaries, power creep that made older Pokemon obsolete almost overnight. And through all of it, Mewtwo never once got left behind. So why? What actually kept it there? Because the easy answer is, it's Mewtwo, it's just strong. But that's not a real answer. Plenty of Pokemon are strong. Plenty of them got banned, then came back down when the meta shifted. Mewtwo didn't. And the reason why is more interesting than most people realize. Let's go back to where this all started. It's 1996. Pokemon Red and Blue have just released in Japan. Competitive play barely exists as a concept. There are no tiers, no Smogon, no spreadsheets calculating damage rolls. There are just Nintendo-sponsored tournaments and kids showing up with whatever team they think is best. And then someone brings Mewtwo. Nintendo's tournament organizers looked at what Mewtwo could do and made a decision before competitive Pokemon even had a framework. They banned it. Along with Mew, Mewtwo became the first Pokemon ever declared off-limits for standard play. Not by a community vote, not after months of debate, by the people running the actual game, at actual events, because they saw what happened when Mewtwo was allowed in. That's where Ubers starts, not with a committee, with 2 Pokemon that were simply too much. And the reason was obvious once you looked at the numbers. Mewtwo had a base special stat of 154. In Generation 1, Special covered both offense and defense. One stat did both jobs. So 154 meant Mewtwo hit harder than anything else and took special hits better than almost everything else at the same time. Its speed was 130, which put it ahead of almost the entire game. And then there was Amnesia. Amnesia doubled Mewtwo's special stat in a single turn. One use of Amnesia, and Mewtwo was sitting at a special stat that nothing in the game could meaningfully touch. 2 uses, and it was functionally uncounterable. There were no reliable answers. The only real option for dealing with Mewtwo without using your own Mewtwo was to constantly threaten it with Explosion, a move that destroys the user. That's how broken the matchup was. Your best answer was to blow something up. So Mewtwo and Mew went into the first Ubers list, and the rest of competitive Gen 1 played out without them. Then Gold and Silver arrived, and things changed. Generation 2 split the special stat into 2 separate numbers, Special Attack and Special Defense. For most Pokemon, this was a meaningful shift in how they worked. For Mewtwo, it meant its 154 Special Attack stayed exactly where it was. The offensive half of what made it terrifying was untouched. It lost the defensive benefit of that combined stat, sure, but Mewtwo was never in Ubers because it was hard to kill. It was there because of what it could do to everything else. Mewtwo stayed. Ubers still barely had a name, but Mewtwo was already its permanent resident. Generation 3 is where something interesting happened. Ruby and Sapphire changed how Amnesia worked. The move no longer gave the same double boost it did in Gen 1. And honestly, for most Pokemon, losing access to a reliable setup move would have been a real problem. But Game Freak had also introduced Calm Mind, and Calm Mind, it turned out, was actually better for Mewtwo. Here's why. Amnesia only boosted Special Attack. Calm Mind raised both Special Attack and Special Defense at the same time. So every turn Mewtwo spent setting up, it was getting harder to hit with special moves too. The standard Gen 3 Ubers Mewtwo set ran Calm Mind, Ice Beam, Thunderbolt, and Self-Destruct. It could boost, sweep, and if something managed to get in its way, it could detonate on it. The nerf to Amnesia ended up giving Mewtwo a more well-rounded setup option. That's the first time you see the pattern that defines Mewtwo's entire history. The game changes, and Mewtwo comes out of the change better than before. Generation 4 brought Diamond and Pearl, and with them, the Life Orb. Life Orb is an item that boosts damage output by 30% in exchange for the holder losing a small amount of HP after each attack. On most Pokemon, you have to think carefully about whether that trade-off is worth it. On Mewtwo, with 154 special attack and 130 speed, it was almost a free upgrade. It was already hitting hard enough to threaten everything in Ubers. Life Orb pushed those numbers into territory where even Pokemon that resisted its moves were taking serious damage. The 130 speed mattered here too. In Gen 4's Ubers metagame, the only Pokemon that outran Mewtwo were Deoxys Speed and Deoxys Attack, both of which were also Uber. Everything else moved after Mewtwo. You couldn't revenge kill it with something faster unless you were also running one of those two Deoxys forms. But Gen 4 had a problem that had actually been building since Gen 2. Blissey. Blissey is a special wall. Enormous HP, decent special defense, moves like Toxic and Seismic Toss that let it stall out opponents over time. Against most special attackers, Blissey was the answer. You'd throw it in, absorb hits, and slowly drain the attacker's HP. And because Mewtwo's moves were all special, Blissey could do the same thing to it. Not beat it cleanly, but survive long enough to be a real obstacle. Gen 4 Mewtwo had to run Taunt or Self-Destruct to deal with Blissey. Taunt stopped it from using status moves. Self-Destruct removed it from the game, but cost Mewtwo its own life in the process. Neither was a clean solution. For the first time across 4 generations, there was a Pokemon with a genuine answer to Mewtwo in standard Ubers play. And then Generation 5 happened. Game Freak gave Mewtwo a signature move in Black and White. It's called Psystrike. On the surface, it looks like a straightforward Psychic-type special attack. It uses Mewtwo's special attack stat to calculate damage. But here's where it gets weird. Psystrike calculates damage against the target's physical defense, not their special defense. Think about what that means for Blissey. Blissey's entire value as a special wall comes from its special defense. Its physical defense is low. Psystrike bypasses special defense entirely and hits the stat Blissey actually can't protect. One move, clearly designed with one specific matchup in mind, and the counter that had been annoying Mewtwo for 2 full generations was suddenly a free kill. Chansey, Blissey's pre-evolution with similar defensive stats, had the same problem. Both of them went from reliable answers to Mewtwo to things Mewtwo now actively wants to see across from it. Smogon's Smog Issue 17 put it plainly. Across all 5 generations covered at the time, Mewtwo had always been one of the top members of the Uber tier. Not just present, top. And here's what makes that remarkable. We're only halfway through the story, because what happens next is the part that most people don't fully appreciate. If you've ever wondered why Game Freak made the decisions they did with Mewtwo in the later generations, stick with this, because the answer is genuinely surprising. Then Generation 6 did something nobody had really seen before with Mewtwo. It gave it 2 Mega Evolutions. Mega Mewtwo Y hit 194 special attack. At the time of X and Y's release, that was the highest special attack stat in the entire game. Combined with 140 speed, up from 130, it was faster and hit harder than the base form already. Calm Mind on Mega Mewtwo Y was terrifying. You were looking at a Pokemon that could set up, outspeed almost everything in Ubers, and hit with a special attack stat that very few defensive Pokemon could meaningfully absorb. Mega Mewtwo X went a different direction entirely. It became a physical attacker with 190 attack. Different type, different role, different set of threats it answered. One Pokemon, 2 completely different competitive identities depending on which Megastone it held. By this point, the Ubers tier had grown from 2 members in Gen 1 to around 50. Decades of legendaries, pseudo-legendaries, and banned threats had piled up, and Mewtwo was still there, still the one that started it all.
Generation 7 added Z-moves, and Mega Mewtwo Y got yet another tool. A Z-crystal on top of Psystrike meant one-hit KO threats on almost anything that didn't resist it. But the more important story in Gen 7 was Fire Blast. Necrozma Duskmane was the dominant steel type of the Sun and Moon era. Specially defensive, tanky, with strong offensive presence. It looked on paper like the kind of Pokemon that could answer Mega Mewtwo Y, resist Psystrike, take a hit back hard. But Fire Blast, after a single Calm Mind boost, 2 HKO'd even a specially defensive Necrozma Duskmane. And Necrozma couldn't OHKO Mewtwo back. The supposed answer wasn't actually an answer. That's the story of every generation. Someone finds what looks like an answer to Mewtwo, and then Mewtwo has a move, or a new mechanic, or a new item that makes the answer not quite work. So why did Mewtwo stay dominant across all 7 generations? The easy version is the stat line. 154 special attack, 130 speed, 680 total base stats. Those numbers gave Mewtwo a floor that power creep couldn't undercut, because the game kept adding new tools on top of a foundation that was already extreme. But the real answer is more specific than that. Mewtwo didn't just have good stats, it had good stats and it received targeted upgrades at exactly the moments it needed them. Calm Mind arrived when Amnesia was nerfed, Life Orb arrived when Mewtwo needed more damage output, Psystrike arrived when Blissey was becoming a genuine problem, Mega Evolutions arrived when the tier needed new threats, Z moves arrived when the game needed another layer of offense. Each new generation didn't just fail to knock Mewtwo down, it handed Mewtwo something new to work with. There's a version of this story where Mewtwo's Gen 1 dominance was just a product of a young, unbalanced game, and it faded into irrelevance as competitive Pokemon matured. That version didn't happen. The game matured around Mewtwo, and Mewtwo adapted to every version of the game it found itself in. In Gen 1, it was an unstoppable sweeper with no counters. In Gen 3, it was a bulkier setup threat that could also self-destruct. In Gen 4, it was a revenge killer that needed clever workarounds for special walls. In Gen 5, it got the move that removed its biggest obstacle. In Gen 6, it split into two distinct Pokemon depending on the Megastone. In Gen 7, it answered the era's dominant defensive threat with a single coverage move. Different roles, different sets, different answers to different problems, but always in Ubers, always at the top. In Generation 1, there were exactly two Ubers, Mew and Mewtwo. The entire concept of a ban tier existed because of those two Pokemon. By Generation 7, there were dozens of legendaries, Mega Evolutions, and Z-move threats all sharing that same tier. Every single one of them was in the same place as the Pokemon that made the tier necessary in the first place. The one that was too strong before competitive Pokemon even had rules. And that's not a coincidence. That's the point. Think about what it actually takes to stay relevant across 7 generations of a game that was actively trying to balance itself. Every new generation introduced Pokemon specifically designed to compete at the highest level. Game Freak wasn't just adding new creatures for the Pokedex. They were adding Arceus, Kyogre, Groudon, Rayquaza, Dialga, Palkia, Giratina, Zekrom, Reshiram, Xerneas, Yveltal, and eventually the entire Necrozma family. These weren't random additions, they were built to be the strongest things in their generation, and every single one of them entered the Ubers tier and found Mewtwo already sitting there. There's a useful way to think about this. Imagine a room that keeps getting more crowded. Every few years, someone opens the door and throws in a new group of the most powerful Pokemon ever created. The room gets louder, more chaotic, harder to navigate. But there's one Pokemon that was in that room before anyone else arrived, and it never gets pushed into a corner. It just keeps finding space. That's Mewtwo in Ubers from 1996 to 2017.
But let's be honest about something. Mewtwo didn't stay dominant purely because of what it was given, it stayed dominant because of what it already had that nothing could take away. That 130 speed is worth talking about more carefully. Speed in competitive Pokemon isn't just about going first, it's about the entire decision tree your opponent has to navigate. When your opponent knows their Pokemon is slower than Mewtwo, every single turn they have to ask, can I afford to stay in? Do I switch? If I switch, what do I bring in that can take a hit and respond? And if Mewtwo's moveset is unpredictable, which it almost always was, then every one of those questions is harder to answer. 130 speed meant Mewtwo was faster than almost everything that wasn't also Uber. And in a tier full of legendaries, being one of the fastest things in the room still mattered enormously. The 154 special attack is even simpler to understand. Damage output at that level means you're never really safe switching in. You might survive one hit from Mewtwo, you might even survive two, but you're taking serious damage every time, and if Mewtwo has the right coverage move for your type, you might not survive even one. That uncertainty is exhausting to play against. It forces conservative decisions. It limits what your team can do. Combined, those two stats create a Pokemon that punishes hesitation. If you don't act decisively against Mewtwo, it sets up, boosts, and the game ends. If you do act decisively, you need to have specifically prepared for whatever set it's running. and Mewtwo's set variety across 7 generations made that preparation genuinely difficult. Let's go back to the Gen 3 example for a second, because it illustrates this better than any other generation. In ADV Ubers, Mewtwo wasn't just one thing. It ran Calm Mind sweeper sets, it ran self-destruct sets designed to blow up on counters, it ran mixed sets that threatened both physical and special answers. Opponents couldn't look at Mewtwo across the field and know what they were dealing with. Was it setting up for a sweep? Was it about to explode? Did it have coverage for the Pokemon they were about to switch in? That uncertainty was a weapon, and it was a weapon Mewtwo carried into every single generation because its stat spread was broad enough to support multiple completely different roles. 110 base attack meant physical sets were viable, 154 special attack meant special sets were dominant, 130 speed meant both versions were threatening, 106 HP meant it could take a hit when it needed to. Most Pokemon are defined by one role. Mewtwo was defined by the fact that you couldn't be sure which role it was filling until it was too late. Now, there's a version of this conversation where someone pushes back and says, okay, but wasn't Mewtwo less dominant in some generations than others? And that's a fair question. The answer is yes, in a narrow sense. There were generations where specific Pokemon posed more credible threats than usual. In Gen 4, Blissey was a genuine obstacle before Psystrike existed. In Gen 7, Marshadow's Spectral Thief could steal Calm Mind boosts directly off Mewtwo, which was a real problem for setup sets. But here's the distinction that matters. Less dominant is not the same as not dominant. Mewtwo being slightly harder to use in Gen 4 than Gen 5 doesn't change the fact that it was still firmly in Ubers in both generations. It never dropped to OU. It never got reevaluated and cleared for standard play. The tier that exists because of Mewtwo never once decided it didn't need to contain Mewtwo anymore. That's a harder thing to achieve than it sounds. The whole point of a tier system is that it's supposed to be dynamic. Pokemon move up and down as the meta shifts. A Pokemon that was too strong in one generation might be perfectly manageable in the next once better checks exist. The system is designed to correct itself over time. Mewtwo is the system's longest uncorrected entry, and the reason for that comes back to something specific about how Mewtwo was designed. Its base stat total of 680 was the highest in the game when Generation 1 released. Game Freak built it to be the strongest Pokemon in existence. That wasn't accidental flavor for the story, it was baked into the numbers, and those numbers had a floor that new generations kept building on top of, rather than surpassing in a way that made Mewtwo obsolete. Think about how power creep usually works. A new generation arrives, brings stronger Pokemon, and the old top tier threats get pushed down because they can't keep up. The new Pokemon hit harder, move faster, have better typing, have access to better moves. The old guard fades.
Mewtwo didn't fade because its floor was high enough that even when new Pokemon surpassed it in raw stats, and eventually some did, Mewtwo still had enough speed, enough special attack, and enough move variety to remain a genuine threat. It didn't need to be the single strongest Pokemon in the tier to stay relevant. It just needed to be strong enough that removing it from Ubers would break standard play. And it cleared that bar every single generation. There's also something worth saying about the moves Mewtwo had access to that had nothing to do with its signature options. Ice Beam covered Dragon types and Flying types. Thunderbolt covered Water types. Fire Blast covered Steel types. Aura Sphere covered Dark types and Normal types. Mewtwo's coverage move pool was broad enough that it could threaten almost any defensive typing in the game with the right set. That meant no single defensive Pokemon could safely answer it without risking being hit by coverage. Arceus Dark was considered one of the more reliable answers to Mewtwo in Gen 5. It resisted Psystrike and could hit back hard with Dark-type moves. But that answer required specifically running Arceus in a Dark-type form, which was its own commitment. And even then, a Mewtwo running Aura Sphere could threaten it. The counters to Mewtwo across 7 generations always came with asterisks, always required specific conditions, always relied on knowing in advance what set Mewtwo was running. That's a fundamentally different situation from a Pokemon that has a clean, reliable answer.
Mewtwo never had a clean, reliable answer. It had conditional answers, set-dependent answers, and answers that stopped working the moment Mewtwo ran one different move. So when you add all of this up, the raw stats, the move variety, the targeted upgrades each generation, the lack of clean counters, the speed that forced constant reactive play from opponents, you get a picture of why 7 straight generations happened. It wasn't luck. It wasn't nostalgia from Game Freak keeping their flagship legendary relevant. It was a combination of an extreme foundation and a series of additions that each solved whatever problem the current metagame had created for Mewtwo. Every time the game found a new way to pressure it, Mewtwo got a new tool. Sometimes that tool was a move. Sometimes it was an item. Sometimes it was a mega evolution that doubled its offensive ceiling. The competitive community recognized this too. Smogon's own writing on Mewtwo across the generations consistently framed it not as a static threat, but as an adaptive one. The question was never whether Mewtwo was good. The question was which version of Mewtwo was good right now, and what set it was likely running, and how you were going to deal with it this generation. That framing tells you everything. When a Pokemon has been in the top tier so long that the conversation shifts from "is it good?" to "which version of it do I need to prepare for?", that Pokemon has achieved something genuinely unusual in competitive play. Mewtwo achieved it 7 times in a row. And the last thing worth sitting with is the context of what Ubers looked like by the end of that run. In Generation 1, Ubers had 2 members. That was it. 2 Pokemon too strong for standard play. By Generation 7, the tier had grown to include dozens of Pokemon. Primals, Megas, Ultra Beasts, full legendary lines with multiple forms. The tier that started because of Mewtwo had become one of the most populated and complex metagames in competitive Pokemon. Every Pokemon in that Gen 7 Ubers tier was there because it was too strong for standard play. And every single one of them was sharing a tier with the Pokemon that made the concept of too strong for standard play necessary in the first place. In 1996, Nintendo banned Mewtwo from their tournaments because they didn't know what else to do with it. 21 years later, the most sophisticated competitive Pokemon community in the world, with decades of tier data and metagame theory behind them, looked at Mewtwo and reached the exact same conclusion. And if that's got you thinking about which other Pokemon have stories like this, legends that the meta never figured out how to solve, drop a comment with the one you want covered next. The best suggestion gets the next video. Subscribe so you actually see it when it comes out, because the algorithm is not going to remind you, and you do not want to miss what's coming. This channel goes deep on exactly this kind of thing, and we're just getting started.